There's a moment every species remembers. The first time they see a human ignore a sign. Not misread it, not fail to understand the symbols, not confuse the language matrix. Just look at it, register it completely, understand every single word, and then keep walking anyway. I've worked Gate 9 for 11 cycles. 11 cycles of watching species from 37 different star systems approach the transit threshold with their credentials extended, their biometric data preloaded, their diplomatic seals glowing softly in the station light. Every species has a protocol. Every species follows it. The Thurian cross-reference their permits twice before stepping forward. The Vreth cluster in groups and send a designated representative first. The Meldori actually back up and reread the signage, even when they've been through the gate 100 times. Then there are humans. The first one I ever processed, and I use that word loosely, because processed implies a series of steps that were followed in some recognizable order, walked through Gate 9 on a Tuesday morning in what they call the 7th month of a year that means nothing to the galactic standard calendar. He was carrying a paper cup of something hot. He was looking at his communication device. He walked past the credential scanner, past the biometric arch, past the permission verification kiosk, past the secondary confirmation terminal, and all the way to the actual interior threshold of the station's restricted zone before he looked up and said, "Oh, did I need to do something back there?" The gate officer on duty that morning was Preth Zhao, a 12-year veteran of Outer Rim transit security. She told me later that she stood there for 6 full seconds without saying anything, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she was genuinely trying to understand what she had just witnessed. That was 4 cycles ago. We've learned a lot since then. My name is Velek Khan. I am a transit observer, which means my job is to watch things happen at the gate and write down what I see so that the review board can understand patterns. It is not an exciting job, usually. Most of what I observe is orderly and predictable. Species approach, species comply, species pass through. The machinery of interstellar transit operates with the elegant reliability of something that has been designed very carefully by very cautious minds. And then humans arrive, and I get to observe something I never had a name for until I started working Gate 9. The name I have for it now is intent without process. Every other species in the galactic transit system operates on a fundamental assumption that permission structures exist for a reason, that the reason is important, and that the most sensible course of action is to understand the reason before proceeding. This is not cowardice or excess caution. It is logic. The universe is large and frequently hostile, and the species that have survived long enough to develop interstellar travel are, almost without exception, the ones that learn to be careful before they learn to be fast. Humans learn to be fast first. They're still working on the careful. I do not mean that as criticism. I have come to understand, over 4 cycles of observation, 1,100 pages of filed reports, and one incident that I am about to describe in full for the first time, that the human approach to permission is not recklessness. It is something else, something that took me a long time to name properly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The review board asked me to start at the beginning. So let me start at the beginning. Corvith Station sits at the edge of what humans call the Kepler frontier, a region of space that was formerly uninhabited until about 60 years ago, when 3 separate species arrived within a decade of each other and decided, with varying degrees of diplomacy, to share it. The Thurian came first. We set up the transit infrastructure because that is what Thurian do. We build the things that allow other things to happen. The Grethali came second, because Grethali follow Thurian the way certain organisms follow warmth. And then humans came third, which is how they usually arrive, after the infrastructure exists, and before anyone has quite figured out how to account for them in the planning documents. Corvith is not a beautiful station. I want to be clear about that because I've read some of the human documentation about it, and they have a tendency to romanticize places that are, in practical terms, just large pieces of pressurized metal floating in gravitationally convenient locations. The station is functional. It has 17 docking bays, 4 transit gates, a commercial sector that smells of Gret Holly spice and recycled atmosphere, and a restricted zone that takes up roughly a third of the station's total floor space. The restricted zone is where the Corvith Compact's administrative offices are located, also the communications hub. Also the Biological Archive, a collection of genetic and environmental samples from every species that has signed or ratified the compact, used for medical purposes and stored under conditions that require extremely precise environmental control. Also, for reasons I have never fully understood, a very good restaurant that I think was originally intended to be a secure meeting space, but gradually became a place where diplomats ate lunch. Access to the restricted zone requires, at minimum, a valid transit credential, a pre-approved entry purpose, a biometric registration, a secondary identity confirmation, a zone-specific clearance code renewed every 48 hours, and physical passage through an unmanned security arch that scans for prohibited materials. 6 steps. Every species manages all 6 steps without incident. Some take longer than others, but everyone does them. Everyone except humans, who, and this is not an exaggeration, have, in the 4 cycles since regular human transit through Corvith began, bypassed at least one mandatory step on 43 separate documented occasions. 43 occasions, I have the reports, I filed most of them myself. And in 43 separate incidents, not one of those humans was trying to cause harm. Not one of them had malicious intent. Not one of them was attempting to infiltrate the restricted zone for any reason beyond the one they'd originally stated when they applied for transit clearance weeks earlier. They simply, in various ways with various degrees of awareness, skipped steps. A Gret Holly administrator named Sulverath told me once that he thought humans were dangerous because they didn't respect boundaries. I told him I thought he was wrong. Humans respect boundaries. They just don't stop at them the way other species do. There's a difference, and it took me a long time to understand it, but it is the most important difference I know. The incident I am here to document began on a cycle morning in the 4th watch. This is the quietest watch, after the freight haulers have docked and before the diplomatic transports from the core systems begin their approach. Gate 9 is typically staffed by 2 officers during the 4th watch, the officer of the hour and the verification specialist. On this particular morning, the officer of the hour was a young Thurian named Pelravoth, in her 3rd cycle on the job, and performing adequately by all measurable standards. The verification specialist was a Gret Holly named Duthkar, who had been at Gate 9 for 6 cycles and had seen, by his own count, every possible way a travel document can be incorrectly formatted. He had not, as it turned out, seen every possible thing. I was positioned at my observation post, which is a small booth between Gate 9 and Gate 8 with a clear sightline to both credential stations and a terminal connected to the station's monitoring network. I have described my booth before in other reports as unremarkable, which is accurate. I eat my morning meal there. I drink something warm and not very good that passes for caffeine equivalent in the Thurian metabolism. I watch. That morning, I was watching the 4th watch foot traffic, a Meldori family of 7 moving through the biometric arch with the characteristic Meldori precision that I find genuinely calming. A freight manifest specialist from the Vreth delegation looking harassed and carrying too many physical documents, and 2 Thurian administrative staff who nodded to Pelravoth with the mild collegiality of people who see each other every day. Then I saw the human. I knew immediately she was human. This is not a remarkable observation. Humans have a distinctive physical profile that is quite recognizable after sufficient exposure, and I had processed enough reports to have a good sense of what I was looking at. She was, and I am describing this in the neutral observational terms I use in all my reports, medium height for a human, carrying a bag over one shoulder that was packed more heavily than its structural integrity probably recommended, wearing clothing that suggested she had dressed quickly, and walking at a pace that communicated she had somewhere to be, and was fairly confident she was going to get there. She had a credential badge clipped to her jacket. This was good. This was actually better than several of the 42 previous incidents, where the human in question had to be asked 3 times before locating their documentation. She walked to the credential scanner, held up her badge without breaking stride, a kind of bypass while complying maneuver that I have only ever seen humans perform, and the scanner beeped green. Then she walked directly past the biometric arch. Not through it, past it. There's a difference. The arch is positioned at a slight angle to the main transit corridor, the way all our security infrastructure is positioned, slightly off the natural walking line, which requires a conscious choice to approach it. Every other species makes that choice automatically, because every other species reads the transit signage and understands that the arch is not optional. The human read the signage. I watched her eyes track across it. She understood the symbols, I could tell from the micropause in her stride, the slight head turn. And then she kept walking, because she was looking at something on her communication device and thinking about something else, and the part of her mind that had registered the sign had apparently decided to file it under "deal with this in a moment," and then never retrieved it. Pelravath called out, "Standard protocol, 3-tone verbal alert in galactic common." The human stopped immediately, turned around. And then she did something that I have since come to understand is a distinctly human gesture, but which confused me greatly the first time I witnessed it. She pressed one hand flat against her own face and made a sound of self-directed exasperation. Not fear, not calculation, not the careful neutral expression species put on when they've been caught doing something wrong and are deciding how to handle it. Just frustration, at herself, genuine, unperformed, immediate frustration. "The arch," she said, "I missed the arch." "You bypassed the biometric registration," Pelravath confirmed. "I know, I'm sorry. I was looking at." She held up the communication device briefly, as if that explained everything, and for humans it probably did. "Can I go back through?" She went back through the arch. The scan completed, she continued. At the permission verification kiosk, she entered her clearance code, frowned at the terminal for a moment when it asked for secondary confirmation, entered that too, and then stood looking at the secondary confirmation terminal with an expression that said she was not entirely sure what it was for but was prepared to engage with it. She engaged with it. It cleared her. She walked through Gate 9's physical threshold into the restricted zone, nodded once to Duthkar with the easy acknowledgement of someone who sees security personnel as humans rather than obstacles, and disappeared around the first corridor bend. Duthkar looked at me across the transit floor. He had the expression I had learned to recognize on Gret Holly faces when humans did something that was simultaneously frustrating and difficult to actually classify as wrong. "That's 44, he said. 43, I said. She went back. He considered this. "Does that count?" I wrote it down as 43.5. I am a thorough observer. Her name was Mayra Vasquez. I know this from her credentials, which I access through standard procedure after any unusual transit event. She was listed in the Corvith Compact's visitor registry as a researcher. Specifically, a xenobiological specialist attached to a human academic institution, with a name that I will reproduce here in full only, because it still strikes me as both very long and very earnest. The Institute for Cooperative Species Studies and Interstellar Ecological Preservation, based in a human city called Buenos Aires. She had a 30-day research access permit, a letter of invitation from the Compact's Biological Archive Division, and a record that showed she had been through Corvith Station twice before. Both previous visits were unremarkable, which is to say both were documented in the standard registry without any incident reports attached. I searched my own files for her name. She was not in them. Whatever she had done on her previous visits, it had been inside normal parameters. Or at least, and I want to be precise here, no one had filed anything, which is not necessarily the same thing. Her stated purpose for this visit was access to the biological archive for what her paperwork described as cross-species atmospheric adaptation data, Phase 3 of ongoing study. I had processed similar research requests before. Xenobiological work was one of the most common reasons non-diplomatic visitors were granted restricted zone access, because the archive was the only place in the Outer Rim with the kind of comprehensive environmental data that serious researchers needed. I made a note of her name and her purpose, and filed the incident as a standard biometric delay, which was the lowest possible classification for a transit irregularity. Then I went back to watching the gate. The second incident, involving Myra Vasquez, happened 4 hours later. I was completing my observation log for the first half of the watch when Duthkar appeared at the door of my booth. He is a large Gret Holly, built for the gravity of his home planet, and when he appears in small spaces, he tends to fill them substantially. He stood in my doorway and said, "The human researcher." I looked up from my log. "What about her?" "She's in Subarchive 3. I put down my documentation instrument. Subarchive 3 was not accessible on a standard research permit. Subarchive 3 contained the atmospheric adaptation data she was studying, yes, but also materials classified under Compact Security Protocol 7, which covered genetic samples of species not yet formally registered with the Galactic Transit Authority. The reason Subarchive 3 required separate access authorization was not that the data was dangerous, exactly, but that the presence of unregistered species data in a formal archive created diplomatic complications that the Compact's legal division had spent 6 years developing protocols to manage. "How did she get into Subarchive 3? I asked. Duthkar made the Gret Holly gesture that roughly translates as "I have a theory, but I am not going to say it yet." "I came with him." The biological archive occupies a full corridor of the restricted zone, divided into subsections by atmospheric seal, each subarchive maintained at the environmental conditions best suited for preserving its contents. Subarchive 3 was the coldest, maintained at a temperature that I found deeply uncomfortable, and that Myra Vasquez, as I discovered when we reached the access corridor, apparently did not find uncomfortable at all. She was standing in the access corridor outside Subarchive 3's sealed door, looking at a portable data terminal she'd brought from somewhere. And this is the detail that I have returned to most often in the 4 cycles since, she was humming. Not performing calm. Not wearing the careful expression of someone who knows they are where they should not be and is managing the situation. Just humming, softly, the way someone hums when they are working on something they find interesting. The sealed door was open. I should explain something about Subarchive 3's sealed door. It is rated at security level 4, which means it requires not just a clearance code but a physical keycard, a biometric palm scan, and a time-locked override that can only be activated during a pre-scheduled access window authorized by the archive director. The door is, in short, not the kind of door you open by accident or by walking past it at speed while looking at your communication device. I looked at the door, I looked at Myra Vasquez, I looked at Duthkar. "How?" I said, and then stopped, because I realized I needed to ask the question more precisely. How did she open the door? Duthkar produced a small physical report from somewhere in his uniform and handed it to me. It was from the station's maintenance division. Earlier that morning, during the 3rd watch, before Myra Vasquez had even arrived at Gate 9, the atmospheric seal on Subarchive 3's access corridor had developed a minor pressure fluctuation. A maintenance technician had been dispatched to investigate. The technician had propped the sealed door open to access the pressure sensor array. The technician had then been called to an urgent secondary assignment in the docking sector and had forgotten to close the door. And Myra Vasquez, who had been given access to the archive corridor for her research, had walked past Subarchive 3's open door, looked inside at the atmospheric adaptation data she was specifically here to study, and as best we could reconstruct, thought something along the lines of, well, the door is open, and walked in. I stood in the access corridor for a moment. Then I walked to Subarchive 3's entrance. "Dr. Vasquez," I said. She looked up from her terminal. She did not startle, which I had learned was characteristic of humans in focused mental states. They process surprises slowly when concentrating, the way they process most things that don't require immediate physical response. Then she registered who I was, or rather, registered that I was station staff, which was the relevant category, and her expression shifted. "Oh," she said, "and then the door." "The door," I confirmed. She looked at the open door, then at me, then at Duthkar, who had appeared behind me. "It was propped open," she said. "Yes," I said. I thought maybe my access had been upgraded." She said it with the specific quality of someone who is offering an explanation rather than an excuse, and who knows the difference. "I was going to check with the archive desk when I finished this section." There was a silence. "I have the data I need for Phase 3, she said. "I wasn't going to take anything, I'm not." She stopped. "I'm sorry. I know what this looks like." I looked at her data terminal. She had been accessing the atmospheric adaptation files, the exact files she had authorization to study. She had not, as far as I could tell from a visual review of the terminal, accessed anything else. The Subarchive 3 materials that were classified under Protocol 7 were in a separate physical section of the room, behind a second internal partition, and she was standing nowhere near that partition. "Please close your terminal," I said, "and come with us to the administrative office." She came. The administrative review of the Subarchive 3 incident took most of the rest of the morning. I filed the required reports. The archive director, a Meldori named Kelsath who communicated primarily in extremely precise written documentation, issued a formal notation in Myra Vasquez's visitor file. Her access was temporarily suspended pending review. In the small conference room where we conducted the administrative interview, I sat across from her and asked the questions I was required to ask. She answered all of them, directly, without consulting any advisory documentation or requesting a diplomatic representative, which any other species would have done automatically in a formal review situation. I asked her if she had been aware that Subarchive 3 required separate authorization. She said yes. She had read the briefing documents before her visit. I asked her why she had entered anyway. She thought about this. Not for a long time. Humans don't sit with questions the way Thurian do, rolling them over and examining all their surfaces before responding. She thought for maybe 10 seconds and then she said, "The door was open and the work was inside. I think," she paused again, "I think I told myself the open door meant it was okay, but I also think I knew underneath that I was rationalizing, and I did it anyway." I wrote that down word for word. Then I asked her, "Why are you telling me that?" She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read immediately. Then she said, "Because it's true and you asked. I have worked at Gate 9 for 11 cycles. I have interviewed a combined total of perhaps 2,000 visitors in formal review settings. I have never, in those 11 cycles, had a subject of a formal review volunteer a self-critical analysis of their own reasoning process, without being specifically asked to do so." I wrote that down too. The review concluded with a formal warning and a 7-day suspension of restricted zone access, which was the minimum applicable consequence for the relevant category of unauthorized entry. Mayra Vasquez accepted this without argument, which was expected. What was not expected, and what I noted in my filing, was that before she left the conference room, she asked if there was anything she could do to help the maintenance team address the pressure fluctuation in the Subarchive 3 access corridor. Not as a deflection. She said it after the formal review was complete, after the consequence had been stated and accepted. She said it as a separate thing. I told her that the maintenance team had already been notified. She nodded and said, "Okay, thank you for the fair hearing," and then she left. I sat in the conference room for a few minutes after she was gone. Then I went back to my observation post and my documentation and my fourth watch cup of not very good caffeine equivalent, and I spent the rest of the day writing the first version of a report that would eventually become this document. What I wrote that day was a question, not an incident summary. The incident summary I filed separately, in the correct format, with all the required fields completed. What I wrote in my personal notation was a question that the day had raised, and that I did not yet have an answer to. The question was this: what does it mean that the most permission-resistant species in the galactic transit system is also the most honest about why? Part 1 Addendum: what Duthkar said later that evening. I want to include this because I think it is relevant, and because Duthkar is not the type of individual who usually says things that I feel compelled to write down. We were completing the end-of-watch inventory, which is a tedious process involving a physical check of all transit documentation terminals, an account of clearance codes issued versus clearance codes processed. A number that is almost always different because species either request clearance codes they never use or use clearance mechanisms they never formally requested. And this discrepancy is simply an acknowledged feature of the transit system that no one has managed to eliminate. Duthkar was cross-referencing the physical count with the digital log. He does this with the mechanical patience of someone who has made peace with tedious work. At some point in the middle of the cross-reference, without looking up, he said, "She's the 44th. I did not need to ask what he meant. 43rd, I said. She went back through the arch. I'm not counting the arch, he said. I'm counting the archive. I conceded the point. He finished a section of the cross-reference and then said, the 44 humans who have done this, none of them were doing anything wrong, were they? This was not entirely accurate as a legal matter, and I said so. You know what I mean, he said. I did know what he meant. None of them had harmful intent. None of them had been attempting deception. They had all, in various ways and for various reasons, encountered a rule or a threshold and continued past it not because they wanted to break it, but because something ahead of them had seemed more immediately real than the structure around it. They walked toward things, I said. And then I stopped, because I wasn't sure I was saying it correctly. Duthkar looked at me. What does that mean? I don't know yet, I said. He made the Gret Holly gesture that means that is a strange thing to say, and I am going to think about it later. Then he went back to his cross-reference. I went back to my documentation. But I wrote that phrase down. They walk toward things. I kept it at the top of my notation file for the next several cycles, because I had the feeling it was important and I wanted to make sure I developed it properly. It took another incident, and a much larger one, before I understood what I meant. Part 2. The incident at Outer Rim Gate 9. Formal testimony. Document classification. Priority review. Galactic Transit Authority. Compact Security Division. Submitted by Senior Transit Observer Velek Khan, Thurian Collective. Incident reference. Gate 9 Priority Event, Cycle 4441, 8th Watch. Purpose: full account of the event designated the Corvith Permission Incident. Supplementary status: appended to Part 1 per Review Board request. I am going to tell you about the night everything changed. Not the night humans were granted the entry exception. That came later, after the committees and the formal deliberations, and the 6 months of compact review that these things always require. I am going to tell you about the night that made the exception necessary. The night that forced the question. It started, as many significant events at Corvith Station did, with something going wrong in the docking sector. The 8th watch at Gate 9 is the watch no one wants. It runs through what humans call the middle of the night, which is a phrase that makes more sense emotionally than it does physically for a space station, but which nonetheless captures something true about the quality of those hours. The reduced traffic, the skeleton staffing, the particular kind of quiet that feels more fragile than actual silence. I was not supposed to be there for the 8th watch. My rotation ended at the 6th. But the transit observer assigned to the 8th watch had developed a respiratory complication that was serious enough to require medical attention and mild enough to be embarrassing. And because I had no strong reason not to stay, I stayed. Duthkar was on his 2nd consecutive watch, which he does sometimes when the staffing schedule has gaps, and which he never complains about. Pelravoth had been replaced by a more senior officer named Seth Rallows, a Thurian in her 9th cycle, with the kind of expression that communicates I have seen this kind of shift before, and I am prepared for it to be unremarkable. The first indication that the 8th watch was not going to be unremarkable came at approximately the 2nd hour. The station's primary alert system emitted a single chime, not the emergency tone, which is a different sound entirely, but the advisory tone that signals a developing situation rather than an immediate crisis. The advisory tone means, pay attention, something is changing, you are not yet required to act but you should be ready. On the monitoring terminal in my observation booth, 3 pieces of information appeared simultaneously. First, an unregistered vessel had entered Corvith Station's docking approach zone. Second, the vessel was broadcasting on a compact emergency frequency, but the signal was fragmented, portions of it recognizable, other portions corrupted or deliberately altered in a way the station's signal analysis systems were flagging as anomalous. Third, the vessel had not responded to 3 standard identification requests. I had seen unregistered vessels before. They are not uncommon at outer rim stations. The paperwork infrastructure of the galactic transit system is extensive, and species at the frontier frequently arrive with documentation that is outdated, incomplete, or formatted for a different regulatory framework. An unregistered vessel is a problem to be solved, not automatically a threat. But the fragmented emergency signal on a compact frequency was not a normal feature of a paperwork problem, and the non-response to identification requests was the kind of thing that moved a situation from advisory to significant. I activated my booth's direct communication link to the station's command center. What the command center told me over the next 40 minutes was the following. The vessel appeared to be a Gret-Halley mid-range transport, modified. This was consistent with a class of vessel known to operate along the outer rim, primarily for cargo transit between stations that were not served by the main compact shipping routes. These vessels were old, frequently repaired, and staffed by crews who preferred loose regulatory oversight, not criminals in the formal classification, but not individuals who spent a lot of time making sure their paperwork was in order. The fragmented emergency signal was, upon closer analysis, consistent with a biological distress beacon, the kind that activates automatically when a ship's medical systems detect a condition beyond what the onboard treatment capacity can manage. The non-response to identification requests was, the command center now believed, because the vessel's communication systems were operating at severely reduced capacity, not evasion, damage. And the vessel was, as of 40 minutes into the advisory situation, docked. Not in a designated docking bay, Not at a formal berth with the required magnetic seal confirmation and atmosphere verification, and the 47 other steps the Corvette docking system requires before a vessel is considered to have legitimately completed its approach. The vessel had extended its boarding connector to one of the station's emergency access points, a physical attachment that the station's external hull is designed to accommodate for exactly this kind of situation. And someone on that vessel had, without authorization, without documentation, without following any of the required steps, connected directly to Corvette Station. They were, in other words, inside. And we did not know what was on that ship. The command center's response to an unverified biological distress situation is specific. I will not reproduce the entire protocol here, because it is lengthy and most of it is not relevant to what happened. The relevant portions are restricted zone lockdown, which seals all interior gates, secondary environmental screening at all access points, and a hold on all incoming and outgoing transit pending threat assessment. Gate 9 went into lockdown at the 2nd hour and 23rd minute. The physical barriers descended, heavy atmospheric panels that seal the gate from the restricted zone side, and are designed to hold against a pressure differential of several atmospheres. The overhead lights shifted from standard operational white to the amber that indicates a non-emergency hold. The terminal screens all displayed the compact's lockdown symbol, which is a circle with an inward-pointing line that I have always thought looks like something expressing reluctance. Duthkar looked at me across the gate floor. "This is going to be a long watch," he said. "Yes," I said. Seth Rallows was already on her communication link to the command center, receiving updates with the calm efficiency of someone in her 9th cycle. She relayed to us. The biological distress assessment was ongoing. The vessel had a crew of 3 identified from the ship's registration data, which the station had eventually been able to pull from their own records rather than waiting for the ship to provide it, all of them Gret Holly. One of the 3 had a medical flag in the compact's health registry, indicating a pre-existing condition that might be relevant to the distress signal. We were waiting. I want to describe the station during a lockdown, because I think it is important context for what came next. A lockdown is not chaos. It does not look the way it looks in the dramatic representations humans make of crisis situations, the running, the alarm sounds, the dramatic lighting. It looks mostly like the absence of movement where there was movement before. The corridors that were occupied are empty. The terminals that were active are displaying hold notices. The personnel who were at their posts are still at their posts, just very still. There is a particular quality to that stillness. It is not calm, exactly. Calm implies ease, and there is no ease in a lockdown. It is more like a collective, involuntary holding of breath. Every species in the galactic transit system does it. Every species, when uncertain and waiting, becomes very still. This is one of the things I noticed about Mayra Vasquez when I found her in the restricted zone corridor at the 2nd hour and 47 minutes of the lockdown. She was not still. The restricted zone was locked down, which meant no one should have been moving through its corridors. The personnel with authorized presence inside the zone had been directed to shelter in place. The administrative offices, the archive rooms, the restaurant that used to be a meeting space, and where 3 compact diplomats were now, presumably, sitting with their excellent food and their considerable anxiety. I was in the restricted zone because my observation post is technically within the zone's perimeter, and because my authorization level allows me to move during lockdowns for monitoring purposes. I had been moving through the section of corridor closest to Gate 9 when my monitoring terminal received a movement alert. A sensor ping from the corridor section nearest the emergency access point where the Gret Holly vessel had docked. Someone was in that corridor. I went to look. I found Mayra Vasquez standing at the end of the corridor that leads to the emergency access hub. She was wearing the same jacket she'd had on that morning, with the credential badge still clipped to it. She had her medical kit, a compact standard first aid pack, the kind researchers in the biological sciences typically carry because their work involves environments where standard medical equipment might not be immediately available. She had it open on the floor beside her, and she was checking its contents with the focused efficiency of someone who was preparing to use it. She looked up when she heard me coming. "I heard the distress signal," she said, before I could say anything. I heard the distress signal, as if that was the relevant fact and the rest was obvious. "Dr. Vasquez," I said, "this corridor is restricted during lockdown." "I know," she said. "You should return to the archive." "The archive is in the other direction," she said. "This direction is where whoever is on that ship is going to come out." She said it with a simplicity that I found in that moment difficult to argue with, which was itself alarming. Simplicity is not the same as correctness. Correctness has to be argued with on its own terms. "The biological distress situation is being handled by the station's medical response team," I said. "They are on their way." "When did they get called?" "The advisory was issued." "When did the medical team get called specifically?" she said. "Not sharp, not adversarial, just precise. The kind of precise that comes from someone who has learned that the difference between the general situation and the specific detail matters enormously." I checked my terminal. The medical response team had been notified at the 2nd hour and 29th minute. It was now the 2nd hour and 49 minutes. "They should be here shortly," I said. "From the medical bay," she said, "on the other side of the station. During a lockdown, when every interior passage has dropped atmospheric panels and the fastest authorized route involves 3 separate security holds." She looked at me. I looked at my terminal. The math was, unfortunately, clear. The medical response team's authorized route through a restricted zone lockdown was not short. "There is a biological distress indicator on that vessel," she said. "I don't know what the condition is. I don't know who is in distress. But I have training in xenobiological emergency response. I have a first aid kit that covers the 3 most common Gret-Halley acute conditions, and I am standing 20 meters from the access point right now." "You do not have authorization to approach that access point," I said. "No," she said, "I know." She held my gaze. I held hers. There was a particular quality to this moment that I have tried to describe accurately in every version of this report, because I think it is the most important detail in the whole account. She was not defiant. She was not calculating. She was not trying to find an argument that would get her what she wanted. She was just waiting. She had laid out the facts as she understood them, and she was waiting to see what I would do with them. In that moment, I understood the phrase I had written down 6 months earlier. They walk toward things. Not because the structures don't exist, not because the rules don't matter, but because when something ahead of them is real, genuinely, urgently real, the distance between where they are and where the thing is becomes the most important measurement in the world. And everything between them and it becomes something they will find a way through or around or past, not out of contempt for the structure, but because the structure is, in that moment, simply not what is most real. Mayra Vasquez was standing 20 meters from an access point where someone might be in medical distress. The rules said she couldn't go forward. The rules were real. The person on the other side was real. And she was a human, which meant that in the calculus she was running, not consciously, not calculatedly, but genuinely and completely, the person was more real. "Stay behind me," I said. The Gret-Halley vessel's boarding connector was attached to Emergency Access Hub 7, a small pressurized chamber designed for exactly the kind of unplanned docking that had occurred. The hub's interior door was sealed with a basic security lock, not a level 4 seal, just a standard hub closure that keeps the atmosphere stable until formal docking procedures can be completed. It requires an override code that transit observers carry as part of their standard authorization package. I entered the code. The door opened. The first thing I registered was the atmosphere, slightly off, carrying compounds consistent with a Gret-Holly vessel's life support system, and something else, something biological, that my translator system flagged as a known indicator of Gret-Holly acute hemothermic disruption, which is, in the simplified medical terminology that my training covers, a condition in which the body's heat regulation fails suddenly and severely, producing a cascade of secondary effects that are dangerous quickly and fatal if untreated within a specific window. The second thing I registered was the crew. There were 3 of them, as the registration data had indicated. 2 were at the connecting corridor end of the hub, carrying the third. The third was the one in distress, a Gret-Holly female. Her skin shifted to the dark mottled coloration that indicates hemothermic crisis, her breathing shallow and too fast. The other 2 were large males, clearly physically exhausted, one of them with a communication device in his hand that he had apparently been trying to use to reach someone. They stopped when they saw us. For 1 second, just one, very still second, all 5 of us were motionless in that small hub. Then Myra Vasquez stepped past me. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just stepped past me, the way you step past something that is in your path when there is something else ahead that requires your attention. She moved to the Gret-Holly female and knelt beside her, and the 2 males, who had every reason to be cautious of a non-Gret-Holly approaching in this situation, did not move to stop her, possibly because of her posture or her kit, or the specific speed and directness of her approach, which communicated something that apparently transcended species boundaries. "How long has she been like this?" she said, and the question was in galactic common, clearly and calmly. One of the males answered. His common was fragmented but enough. 40 minutes, maybe more. She had been worse. She was stable but needed treatment. Myra Vasquez had her kit open before he finished the sentence. Her hands moved with the particular efficiency of someone whose training has been practiced enough to become automatic. She was not performing competence. She was simply competent, in the way that competence looks when it is real and not displayed. I stood in the hub entrance and watched. I filed my report later, the proper incident documentation, the authorization log, the note that I had entered the hub under Transit Observer Emergency Provisions, the record that the medical response team arrived 9 minutes after we did and found the patient stable. I filed everything correctly and in the right order. But what I am filing here, for the review board, is what I actually remember. I remember the sound of Myra Vasquez's medical kit, the small, precise sounds of someone working. The way the 2 Gret-Holly males watched her, not with trust exactly, not immediately, but with something that looked like it was on its way to trust. The way the patient's breathing changed over the 11 minutes we were there, not dramatically, not cinematic, just measurably, incrementally in the direction of better. I remember thinking, she does not have authorization to be in this corridor. She does not have authorization to board this vessel's connecting hub. She does not have authorization to administer medical treatment to compact visitors. Every single thing she is doing is a violation of some protocol or another. And the Gret-Holly woman in front of her is breathing. The medical response team arrived. They took over the treatment with the authority of their station, and Myra Vasquez stepped back immediately, without being asked, and let them work. She handed over the relevant information, what she had assessed, what she had administered, what the patient had reported, in the clear, specific language of someone who knows how to transfer medical information accurately. Then she stepped back further and stood against the hub wall, and her hands were shaking. Not while she was working. After, I noticed because I was watching. During the entire 11 minutes, her hands had been completely steady. The moment the medical team took over, the steadiness went away. I moved to stand beside her. "Dr. Vasquez." "I know," she said quietly. "I know what I did." "Do you?" I entered a restricted access hub without authorization. I administered medical treatment without compact certification. I'm going to have to file about 17 different reports, aren't I? At least, I said. She looked at the Gret Holly woman, who was now on the medical team's portable support equipment, and whose coloration had shifted back toward the healthier end of the spectrum. Okay, she said. That was all just okay. The aftermath of the Corvith permission incident, which is what the review board called it, because naming incidents is one of the things review boards do, was long and complicated and generated more documentation than any single event in Gate 9's operational history. The formal proceedings were conducted over 3 separate sessions. Mayra Vasquez attended all of them. She answered every question. She did not minimize or deflect. She described her reasoning in the corridor with the same honest self-awareness she had shown in the Subarchive 3 review. I knew the rules, I understood them. I made a calculation that the immediate situation took priority, and I acted on that calculation. She said it without drama and without apology for the core decision, which is different from apologizing for the inconvenience caused. The Compact's legal division produced, eventually, a 43-page analysis of the incident, which I have read in full and which can be summarized approximately as follows. Mayra Vasquez broke at least 7 distinct regulations. Her presence in the hub was unauthorized. Her medical intervention was technically unlicensed for the Compact's jurisdiction. Her access of Emergency Hub 7 via Transit Observer Override was a misuse of my authorization, which makes me also technically in violation of at least 2 provisions. The 43-page analysis also noted, in its conclusion, that the Gret Holly patient, whose name is Rel Soth, and who has since made a full recovery, would have experienced potentially fatal hemothermic cascade if treatment had been delayed by the additional 9 to 12 minutes required for the authorized medical team to arrive via the lockdown route. 43 pages, and that fact is in the last paragraph. I have thought about that a great deal. About what it means that the structure of formal documentation puts the procedural violations first and the living person last. Not because the document is wrong, it is correct, and the procedural violations are real, but because of what that ordering reveals about the difference between how systems think and how humans act. Systems think in sequence. They process step by step, rule by rule, authorization by authorization. This is not a flaw. This is how systems maintain reliability across thousands of interactions with hundreds of species across every possible variation of circumstance. A system that can be overridden by individual judgment in any given moment is a system that is not a system. Humans think in presence, in what is real right now in front of me. They can learn the rules, they can follow the sequence, they can be trained and certified and authorized and documented, and they will do all of that reliably in every situation that has the ordinary quality of ordinariness. But when something real is in front of them, genuinely, urgently real, the sequence becomes something they move through rather than something they stop at. Not contempt, not defiance, just presence. The animal awareness that something alive is closer than the paperwork. Rel Soth is alive. This is the realest thing in the 43-page report. The review board's deliberations lasted 6 months. I filed 7 supplementary reports during that period, including this document which was requested by the board's chair, a Meldori named Kelsath. Yes, the same Kelsath who had issued the notation in Mayra Vasquez's file after the Subarchive 3 incident, which I think is relevant to her willingness to hear the fuller account. After she read my initial testimony and wrote back with 3 words in Galactic Common. Write it all. So I did. The outcome of the deliberations was, to my knowledge, unprecedented in the Galactic Transit Authority's history. The review board recommended, and the Compact ultimately ratified, after its own additional review period, a formal amendment to the Corvith Station Access Protocols. The amendment is designated Amendment 7H in the official registry. It is one paragraph long. It states that human visitors to Corvith Station in possession of a valid transit credential and a stated purpose consistent with their access category are granted conditional authorization to act on their own judgment in situations of immediate medical or safety distress, without prior permission, subject to formal review within 72 hours of the action taken. Without prior permission. It is the only clause of its kind in the Galactic Transit Authority's entire regulatory framework. No other species has it. No other species was considered for it. When the amendment was filed, I was asked by a junior administrator whether I thought it was appropriate, whether I thought it was right, that humans got an exemption that no other species was granted. I told her what I had been thinking about for 6 months. Every other species at Corvith Station, every species in the galactic transit system, has survived long enough to build interstellar travel by learning, over thousands of years, to be careful, to wait, to look before stepping, to verify before committing, to construct the systems and the protocols and the authorization chains that make large-scale cooperation possible across incompatible biologies and incompatible homeworlds and incompatible histories. These are not small things, they are enormous things. The miracle of the compact is that it exists at all, that species so different from each other have built a framework for coexistence that works, imperfectly but genuinely, and that the imperfection has not destroyed it. But careful species wait, and sometimes, in the space where they are waiting and verifying and completing the sequence, something real slips away. Humans are not a careful species. They have, in the 60-odd years since they arrived at Corvith, driven us to the edge of exasperation more times than I can count. They miss the arch. They walk through the wrong door. They make judgments that are not theirs to make, on timelines that are not formally authorized, for reasons that are not always explainable within the existing regulatory framework. And they do it by walking toward things, by refusing, at the deepest level of their strange and noisy nature, to let the distance between them and something real become more important than the real thing itself. The amendment is not a reward. It is not a compliment. It is the compact's formal acknowledgement of something that the event logs at Gate 9 had been recording for 4 years before anyone was willing to say it plainly. Humans are going to act. When something real is in front of them, they are going to move toward it. The question the compact faced was not whether to allow this. It was never a question of allowing it, because the event logs made clear that permission had never been the relevant variable. The question was whether to build the permission around the behavior that was already happening, so that when the next Rel Soth appears at the end of a lockdown corridor, the human standing 20 meters away doesn't have to choose between the right action and the authorized one. That is what Amendment 7H is. It is the compact learning to build its structure around the shape of human instinct, rather than asking human instinct to wait for the structure. I saw Mayra Vasquez once more before her 30-day permit expired. She was leaving the biological archive with a data pack that, I noted with professional interest, she had checked out through the correct formal process, through the right desk, with the right documentation. All 6 steps, completed in order. She saw me and stopped. "Observer Velik Khan," she said. "Dr. Vasquez." She looked like she was going to say something, and then she looked like she was deciding what that something should be. Then she said, "I heard about the amendment." "Yes," I said. "I don't," she stopped. "I want you to know I'm not sure I deserved that." "No one suggested you deserved it," I said. "It is not about deserving, it is about what is true." She considered that, then she nodded once. "Thank you," she said, "for the hub." "You were already there," I said. "I only followed." She smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that is more real for being small, and she went toward the transit gate, and I watched her go, and I wrote down one more thing in my notation file before I filed the last version of this report. The compact is 43 pages long. The person it describes is alive. These are not unrelated facts. The gap between them is P.